March 9th, 1945, 11:42 in the evening. Captain Robert Morgan sat in the cockpit of his B-29 Superfortress at an altitude of just 5,000 feet above Tokyo Bay, so low he could smell the salt water mixing with aviation fuel. The city sprawled beneath him like a constellation of amber lights, thousands of paper lanterns and cooking fires glowing through the wooden lattice of traditional homes. In 6 hours, those same lights would be replaced by something else entirely, columns of flame so intense they would create their own weather system, generating winds of hurricane force that would turn the greatest city in Asia into a furnace visible from 200 miles away. But Morgan did not know that yet. He believed this would be just another mission, another attempt to cripple the enemy's industrial capacity through precision strikes. He was wrong in ways he could not yet imagine. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over Tokyo that night would transform not only a city, but the very philosophy of aerial conflict, replacing the doctrine of precision targeting with something far more devastating and morally complex. This is the story of how desperation, innovation, and the terrible mathematics of total conflict converged to create one of the most destructive single events in human history, and how those who survived it would forever remember the incendiary clusters that fell from the sky as Satan's flowers. To understand why 334 American bombers were flying toward Tokyo that night, we must first travel back 18 months to the dusty proving grounds of Dugway, Utah. There, in the autumn of 1943, the United States Army had constructed something unprecedented, a perfect replica of a working-class Tokyo neighborhood. Engineers from Standard Oil had consulted with architects who had lived in Japan, studying photographs, blueprints, and even importing tatami mats to ensure authenticity. The result was a cluster of 12 buildings, complete with sliding shoji screens, cedar support beams, and the distinctive curved tile roofs that had sheltered Japanese families for centuries. The purpose of this meticulous recreation was simple: to find the most efficient way to set it on fire. Dr. Raymond Ewell, a chemical engineer from the National Defense Research Committee, stood watching as incendiary after incendiary was tested against the mock neighborhood. Thermite burned too slowly, standard magnesium scattered inefficiently. Then came the M69, a hexagonal cylinder 6 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, weighing just 6 pounds. Inside was a jellied gasoline mixture that chemists had developed by combining naphthenic and palmitic acids, a substance that would later become infamous under the name napalm. When the M69 struck a surface, a small explosive charge would detonate after 3 to 5 seconds, spraying the burning gel in all directions and adhering to whatever it touched. The test results exceeded all expectations. Within minutes, the replica neighborhood was consumed. Ewell recorded in his notes that the buildings burned so completely that structural collapse occurred in under 15 minutes. The curved tile roofs, which might have been expected to provide some protection, actually made things worse. They trapped heat and channeled it downward, turning each home into a kiln. But the desert of Utah was not Tokyo. The mock buildings stood isolated, without the density of a real city. There were no narrow streets to channel winds, no underground water mains to run dry, no huddled families to flee into the night. The gap between laboratory success and operational reality remained vast, and closing it would require something more than new weapons. It would require a new way of thinking. Enter Curtis LeMay. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay arrived in the Mariana Islands to take command of the 21st Bomber Command. At 38 years old, he was one of the youngest generals in Army Air Force's history, and also one of the most frustrated. The B-29 bombing campaign against Japan had been a disappointment. The massive aircraft, each costing $600,000, 3 times the price of a B-17, had been designed for high-altitude precision strikes. But the jet stream over Japan created winds exceeding 200 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, scattering bombs across miles of countryside. Cloud cover obscured targets on 70% of mission days, and the aircraft themselves suffered constant mechanical failures their temperamental Wright R3350 engines prone to catching fire in flight. LeMay had inherited a command that was hemorrhaging aircraft and accomplishing little. In his first 6 weeks, the 21st Bomber Command flew 12 missions and destroyed exactly one significant target. The Pentagon was beginning to question whether the entire B-29 program, into which the nation had poured $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project, was a colossal waste of resources. LeMay retreated to his quarters and began to think. The solution he devised was radical enough to end his career if it failed. Instead of high-altitude daylight precision strikes, he would send his bombers over Tokyo at night, at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, well within range of anti-aircraft defenses. To compensate for the increased vulnerability, he would strip the aircraft of their defensive armament, removing tail guns, waist guns, and most of their ammunition. This would reduce weight by 3,000 pounds per aircraft, allowing each plane to carry an additional 3 tons of incendiaries. The lower altitude would also mean less fuel consumption and reduced strain on the engines, increasing both payload capacity and aircraft reliability. His staff officers were horrified. Colonel John Montgomery, his operations officer, warned that they would lose 70% of their aircraft to enemy defenses. LeMay listened, nodded, and gave the order anyway. On the afternoon of March 9th, mission briefings began across the Marianas. At North Field on Guam, Sergeant Harold Barton of the 19th Bombardment Group sat in a metal folding chair and learned that everything he knew about aerial operations was about to change. There would be no formation flying. Instead, each aircraft would navigate independently to the target area. There would be no defensive guns. The weight savings were more important than protection. And there would be no high-explosive bombs, only incendiaries, thousands upon thousands of M69 clusters, each bundle containing 38 individual bomblets that would separate at 2,000 feet and scatter across an area the size of a football field. The target was a 12-square-mile rectangle on the eastern side of Tokyo, bounded by the Sumida River to the west and the Ara River to the north. Intelligence officers explained that this area contained 87,000 people per square mile, one of the highest population densities on Earth. There were no significant military targets within the zone. The district was home to small workshops, cottage industries, and working-class families who lived in densely packed wooden homes, separated by streets often no wider than a man's outstretched arms. Barton raised his hand and asked what the objective was, if not military infrastructure. The briefing officer paused before answering. The objective, he explained, was to destroy the residential areas that housed the workers who staffed the factories throughout the city. The target was not concrete or steel. The target was wood and paper and human beings. Barton lowered his hand and said nothing more. Across the East China Sea, in the very neighborhood that had been selected for destruction, a 17-year-old girl named Haruyo Nihei was preparing for bed. She lived with her parents, her grandmother, and her 3 younger siblings in a 2-story wooden house that her grandfather had built 40 years earlier. The house stood on a narrow lane called Kikukawa-cho in the Fukagawa ward, less than 2 miles from the Sumida River. Like every home in the neighborhood, it was constructed almost entirely of combustible materials: cedar framing, pine flooring, paper screens, straw tatami mats. The only significant non-flammable elements were the roof tiles and a small clay stove in the kitchen. Haruyo had spent the day at the local elementary school, where she and other students had been mobilized to dig fire breaks. Wide lanes cleared of buildings that might stop the spread of fire. It was exhausting work, and she had come home with blisters on her hands and dust in her hair. Her mother had prepared a simple dinner of rice porridge with pickled vegetables, and now Haruyo was helping her grandmother hang the futons in preparation for sleep. She had no way of knowing that in Utah 18 months earlier, a replica of her home had burned to the ground in under 15 minutes. At 11:35 that night, the first Pathfinder aircraft crossed the coast of Japan north of Tokyo Bay. These were specially trained crews whose job was to mark the target area with incendiaries, creating a flaming X that subsequent aircraft would use as an aiming point. Major Thomas Power, leading the Pathfinder force, identified his mark and gave the order to commence operations. At 11:42, the first M47 incendiary bombs, larger than the M69s designed specifically for initial target marking, tumbled from the aircraft and began their long fall toward the sleeping city below. Captain Robert Morgan, following 3 minutes behind the Pathfinders, saw the first fires ignite. From 5,000 feet, they looked almost beautiful, orange blossoms unfolding against the dark fabric of the city. Within minutes, those blossoms began to merge, their light growing stronger, their colors shifting from orange to yellow to white as the temperature climbed. Morgan's bombardier, Lieutenant James Hatfield, lined up on the burning X and released their payload at 11:58. The aircraft lurched upward as 7 tons of incendiary clusters fell away. Hatfield watched them descend, the bundles breaking apart at 2,000 feet, the individual bomblets spreading into a glittering pattern that caught the firelight from below. He had never seen anything like it. The scattering bomblets looked like flowers opening, their petals spreading as they fell. Far below, Haruyo Nihei was awakened by the air raid sirens. This was not unusual. There had been alerts almost every night for months, and her family had developed a routine. Her father went to the roof to watch for fires, while her mother gathered the younger children. Her grandmother collected the emergency bag containing their most important documents, the family register, ration cards, her father's employment papers. Haruyo pulled on her padded air raid hood and stepped into the small garden behind the house. The sky to the northwest was glowing. At first, she felt no fear. Fires were common during raids, and the neighborhood firefighting associations had been trained to extinguish them. But as she watched, the glow intensified with a speed that seemed impossible. It was not spreading gradually, the way a normal fire would. It was erupting as if the entire horizon had suddenly ignited at once. And then she heard a sound she had never heard before. A low, rising roar, like a distant waterfall that was growing closer. The physics of what was happening were already beyond human control. As the M69 bomblets ignited thousands of individual fires across a zone of several square miles, the rising heat created a massive updraft, hot air rushing upward at tremendous velocity. This drew cooler air in from the surrounding areas, generating winds that increased in strength as the fire grew. Within 30 minutes of the first bombs falling, ground-level winds in the target area exceeded 50 miles per hour. Within an hour, they would reach hurricane force, winds of 80 miles per hour that ripped tiles from roofs, threw people off their feet, and fed the flames with endless streams of oxygen. Haruyo's father came down from the roof. His face was pale, and he spoke only one word: run. The family poured into the street to find it already crowded with neighbors, all moving in the same direction, toward the Sumida River, the only large body of water in the immediate area. Haruyo's grandmother was slow, her bound feet making it difficult to walk quickly, and Haruyo took her arm while her father carried the youngest child. The streets were narrow, designed for foot traffic and handcarts, and within minutes they became clogged with people, their passage further blocked by families dragging possessions, by water carts that had been abandoned when their crews fled, by debris falling from burning buildings on either side. The temperature was rising. Haruyo could feel the heat on her face growing stronger with each passing minute. The air itself seemed to be warming, becoming difficult to breathe, and she understood with sudden clarity that the river might be too far away. She pulled her grandmother faster, weaving through the crowd, no longer caring about politeness or protocol, driven by an animal instinct that screamed at her to reach water. Above her, the American bombers continued to arrive. Staff Sergeant Walter Sherrill, a radio operator on a B-29 from the 73rd Bombardment Wing, looked down at Tokyo and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He had participated in bombing operations over Europe, had seen Hamburg and Dresden and Berlin burn, but this was different. The fires below had merged into a single mass that covered so much of the city, it was difficult to tell where the flames ended, and the darkness began. The smoke column rose past 20,000 feet, higher than their own cruising altitude over Europe, and the turbulence it generated was throwing the aircraft around like a toy. But what disturbed Sherrill most was the smell. Even at 7,000 feet with the windows sealed, he could smell burning. Not just smoke, not just wood and paper, but something else, a sweet, acrid odor that caught in his throat and made him want to gag. It would be weeks before he understood what that smell was. In that moment, he only knew that it was wrong, fundamentally wrong, and that what was happening below them had crossed some threshold that could never be uncrossed. The bombers continued to arrive in a stream that would last for 3 hours. Each aircraft released its payload and then turned for home, its crew looking back at a glow that remained visible for 200 miles. In total, 334 B-29s would drop nearly 1,700 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo that night, more than 500,000 individual M69 bomblets that would ignite approximately 16 square miles of the city. In the streets below, the population was discovering that there was no escape. The wind-driven fire was moving faster than people could run. Streets that had been clear moments before were suddenly walled with flame on both sides. The fire breaks that Haruyo and her classmates had spent weeks digging proved useless. The winds simply threw burning debris across them, igniting the buildings on the other side. The Sumida River, which thousands were struggling to reach, offered little protection. Its banks were lined with warehouses and lumber yards that burned with particular intensity, and the heat from these fires made it impossible to approach the water's edge in many locations. Those who did reach the river faced another horror. The water was crowded with people, swimming, wading, clinging to boats and debris, and as the fire on both banks intensified, the surface of the river itself began to heat up. People who had sought refuge in the water found themselves being cooked from below, even as they burned from above. Many drowned, pulled under by the weight of their soaked clothing, or by the panic of others grabbing at them. The morning would reveal thousands of bodies floating in the Sumida, so many that they would dam up against the bridges and have to be cleared with poles. Haruyo Nihei reached the river at approximately 2:15 in the morning. By that time, she had lost her father and her youngest sibling in the crowd, and her grandmother had collapsed from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Haruyo had tried to carry her, but the old woman was too heavy. And finally, her grandmother had pushed her away, telling her to save herself, that it was enough for the family line to continue through her. Haruyo had refused to leave, had kept pulling at her grandmother's arm, until a stranger, a man she had never seen before and would never see again, picked her up bodily and threw her toward the river, telling her not to waste her grandmother's sacrifice. She found a spot on a concrete pier, partially sheltered from the radiant heat by a stone warehouse that had not yet caught fire. She squatted there with 100 other survivors, watching the city burn. The flames were white now, so hot that they were difficult to look at directly, and the roar of the firestorm was so loud that people had to shout to be heard even when standing next to each other. Firebrands, pieces of burning debris carried by the wind, fell around them like rain, and every few minutes someone would catch fire and have to be beaten out by their neighbors. The heat from the burning warehouse behind them grew steadily worse, and Haruyo understood that if the fire reached their pier, they would have nowhere to go except into the river, where so many were already perishing. She thought about her grandmother and began to weep. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the last American bomber turned for home. By that time, the target area had ceased to exist as a functional part of the city. The fire had consumed everything: houses, workshops, schools, temples, hospitals, leaving only a wasteland of ash, rubble, and scattered chimney stacks. The Fukagawa ward where Haruyo had grown up was simply gone, replaced by a smoking desert that would remain hot enough to burn bare feet for days. As dawn broke on March 10th, the survivors began to emerge from their shelters and refuges. What they found was a landscape that seemed to belong to another planet. Where streets had been, there were now only vague depressions in the ash. Where neighborhoods had stood, there were now fields of debris, studded with the twisted remains of metal objects, bicycles, sewing machines, bed frames, that had survived the fire. Bodies were everywhere, not hundreds but thousands, many of them burned beyond recognition, shrunk and blackened and curled into fetal positions by the intense heat. The civilian authorities were overwhelmed. There was no precedent for destruction on this scale, no plans that could accommodate so many casualties. Corpse collection teams worked for days, piling bodies on flatbed trucks and delivering them to schoolyards and temple grounds that had been designated as emergency morgues. The official count would eventually reach 83,793 confirmed casualties, with another 40,000 missing and presumed deceased, but these numbers were almost certainly undercounts. Entire families had vanished together, leaving no one to report them missing. Entire blocks had burned so completely that no bodies could be recovered. The true number who perished that night would never be known, but most historians place it between 90 and 100,000, more than the immediate toll of either atomic strike that would come 5 months later. Haruyo Nihei survived. She found her father and her youngest brother 2 days later at an emergency shelter in Ueno Park, and learned that her mother and other siblings had also escaped by a different route. Her grandmother had not survived. Her body was never recovered, likely cremated by the firestorm along with the house where she had lived for 40 years. The family had lost everything they owned, except the clothes they were wearing and the documents in the emergency bag, which Haruyo's grandmother had pressed into her hands before pushing her away. In the weeks that followed, Haruyo would hear her neighbors use a phrase she had never encountered before. They called the falling incendiary clusters flowers from the sky, but not beautiful flowers, not cherry blossoms or chrysanthemums. They called them Satan's flowers. The term captured something that more clinical language could not: the obscene beauty of the falling bomblets as they scattered and ignited, the grotesque contrast between their flower-like appearance and the devastation they wrought. It was a phrase born from the need to name the unnameable, to find words for an experience that exceeded the normal boundaries of human suffering. The American crews who had carried out the mission were also struggling to process what they had done. Captain Robert Morgan landed at Guam at 7:45 that morning after a flight of nearly 15 hours. He was exhausted, his flight suit soaked with sweat, his hands shaking from hours at the controls. At debriefing, he told the intelligence officers that he had never seen anything like it, that the fires had been visible from 150 miles away on the return flight, that the smoke column had reached higher than they could fly, that the smell had penetrated the aircraft and made the crew sick. When asked to assess the effectiveness of the mission, he paused for a long moment before answering. Effective was not the right word, he said. Effective implied some kind of proportionality between means and ends. What they had done that night was something else entirely. General LeMay received the initial reports with satisfaction. The mission had achieved complete surprise. The Japanese defenses, accustomed to high-altitude attacks, had been unprepared for low-level operations at night. Losses had been minimal: 14 aircraft missing, approximately 42 crewmen lost. The exchange ratio, American losses compared to Japanese damage, was unprecedented. In a single night, they had done more damage to Japanese industrial capacity than the entire previous 5 months of operations combined. LeMay immediately ordered follow-up strikes. On March 11th, 313 B-29s attacked Nagoya with incendiaries. On March 13th, 301 aircraft hit Osaka. On March 16th, 331 bombers returned to Kobe. In 10 days, the 21st Bomber Command dropped nearly 10,000 tons of incendiaries on Japan's 4 largest cities, destroying 32 square miles of urban area and rendering approximately 2 million people homeless. The campaign would continue for 5 months, until Japanese surrender in August. By the time it ended, 66 Japanese cities had been wholly or partially destroyed by incendiary attack. An estimated 330,000 civilians had lost their lives, and approximately 8.5 million had been made refugees. The physical destruction was so complete that when American occupation forces arrived in September, they found cities that had effectively ceased to exist, endless plains of rubble where millions of people had once lived, worked, and raised their families. The men who planned and executed these operations understood that they were crossing moral boundaries that could not be uncrossed. LeMay himself acknowledged that if America lost the conflict, he would be prosecuted for his actions. But he and others argued that the incendiary campaign had shortened the conflict and saved lives, that the devastation inflicted on Japanese cities, terrible as it was preferable to the alternative of a ground invasion that military planners estimated would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese. This argument remains controversial 80 years later, and it should. The deliberate targeting of civilian population centers raises profound ethical questions that cannot be resolved by appeals to military necessity. The suffering inflicted on the people of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities was real and devastating, regardless of the strategic calculations that produced it. The children who burned, the grandmothers who suffocated, the families who were incinerated together, they were not abstractions or statistics. They were human beings with names and faces and stories, and their deaths diminish us all. But it is also true that the men who carried out these operations were not monsters. They were ordinary people, farmers and factory workers, students and teachers, fathers and sons, who found themselves caught up in a conflict of unprecedented scale and ferocity. They did what they believed was necessary to end that conflict and bring themselves and their friends home alive. Many of them were haunted by what they had done for the rest of their lives, waking from nightmares of burning cities and wondering whether there might have been another way. Staff Sergeant Walter Sherrill, the radio operator who had smelled the burning city from 7,000 feet, never spoke about the Tokyo mission for 40 years. Then, in 1985, he attended a reunion of his bomb group and found that others shared his silence. They began to talk tentatively at first, and then with increasing openness, sharing memories they had kept locked away for decades. Sherrill told them about the smell, and others nodded. They had smelled it too, had recognized it without wanting to acknowledge what it meant. One man wept openly, speaking for the first time about a nightmare he had had since 1945, in which he was trapped in a burning building while flower-shaped flames fell from the sky. Haruyo Nihei also struggled with her memories. For many years after the event, she could not speak about what had happened. The words would not come, or they came out wrong, unable to capture the reality of what she had experienced. She married, had children, built a new life in a new neighborhood, but the events of March 9th stayed with her, emerging in unexpected moments. When she smelled smoke, when she heard a certain pitch of wind, when she saw her daughter's face in the firelight. In 1983, she gave her first public testimony about the firebombing. She stood before an audience at the Tokyo Memorial Hall for air attack victims and spoke for 2 hours, describing everything she could remember: the glow on the horizon, the roar of the wind, the heat that grew until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, the moment when her grandmother pushed her away. She spoke about the people she had seen that night, the mother carrying a baby that was already dead, the man whose hair caught fire as he ran, the children calling for parents they would never find. And she spoke about the phrase her neighbors had used, the flowers of Satan, explaining that it captured something true about the experience, that the falling incendiaries had possessed a terrible beauty, a lethal grace that made their destructive power even more obscene. After her testimony, a man approached her. He was American, elderly, and he walked with a cane. He told her through an interpreter that he had been a crewman on one of the bombers that night, that he had thought about the people below him every day for almost 40 years, and that he was sorry, not for following orders, which he still believed had been necessary, but for the suffering that those orders had caused. He asked if she could forgive him. Haruyo looked at him for a long time before answering. She did not know if forgiveness was the right word, she said. What had happened that night was too vast for simple forgiveness. It belonged to history now, not to individuals. But she could recognize him as a human being, as someone who had also suffered in his way, and that recognition was perhaps enough. They were both old now, both carrying memories that would go with them to their graves. Perhaps the best they could do was to bear witness together, to ensure that what had happened was not forgotten, so that future generations might find a better way. The elderly American nodded. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood there together for a moment, two people from opposite sides of a terrible divide, joined by memories of a night when the sky itself had seemed to catch fire. This is what remains of the Tokyo firebombing: the testimonies, the photographs, the statistics, and the contested interpretations that continue to provoke debate among historians and ethicists. But beneath all of that, there is something else, something that cannot be captured in numbers or arguments. It is the memory of individual human beings facing an experience that exceeded their capacity to understand or survive, and the knowledge that such experiences are not confined to the past. The technology has changed, the targets have changed, the justifications have changed, but the fundamental reality remains that modern conflict falls hardest on those least able to resist it, that civilians bear the greatest burden, that children and grandmothers and ordinary families pay the price for decisions made by generals and politicians in distant rooms. The flowers of Satan fell on Tokyo 80 years ago, but they are still falling somewhere. They will continue to fall as long as human beings persuade themselves that the lives of others can be calculated and weighed and found wanting. The only counter to this calculation is memory, the stubborn, persistent memory of what those calculations actually mean, measured not in square miles destroyed or industrial capacity eliminated, but in grandmothers who pushed their granddaughters toward the river, in children who called for parents who never came, in survivors who carried their memories for decades without speaking, and then spoke so that others might understand. Haruyo Nihei passed away in 2012 at the age of 84. She had spent her final years working with peace organizations, sharing her testimony with school groups and international visitors, ensuring that her memories would survive her. At her memorial service, her daughter read from a letter Haruyo had written shortly before her passing. In it, she returned one final time to the image of the falling incendiaries, the flower-shaped clusters that had scattered and ignited and consumed everything she knew. They were beautiful, she wrote, and that was the most terrible thing about them, beauty and destruction falling together from the sky. She hoped that someday human beings would learn to separate them, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.